I'm Susan Holson, the Director of Education Services for VSBA. Most of you know me by now. Joining me today, we have a really wonderful program with very esteemed guests, and I'm very grateful to have them. So, without further ado, I will introduce our panelists to you, who are all here eagerly waiting to join us. We'll start with Mark Peralt. Mark is the Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Joint Fiscal Office, responsible for, among other things, education. And he will give us the sort of big picture overview of where the state education finances stand. Then Brad James from the Agency of Education, he's the Education Finance Manager at the agency. He will give us an update on, particularly on some of the grants and some of the unusual funding mechanisms that are available and what impact they may have on budgeting for fiscal 2022. And finally, we have Nathan Lavery joining us by phone at the moment. He's going to try and get his video up and running, but at the moment he's on by phone. Nathan is the Senior Director of Finance for the Burlington School District and also currently serving as President of the Vermont Association of School Business Officers, commonly known as VASBO. So with no further ado, I'm going to pop out of here so you don't have to look at me, and we'll all eyes on Nathan. All eyes on Mark. Oh, and I should also just introduce Sue Siglowski. Sorry, Mark. Sue, of course, is the Executive Director of VSBA, and in as much as she haunts the state offices, we thought we'd let her be on the line today and just keep some clarity, make sure we're all focused on school board issues. Okay, Mark, sorry about that.
No problem.
Please.
So good afternoon. It's afternoon now, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to assume yes. All right. So as of today, I don't have any changes to report on the education fund outlook for FY21. And we haven't yet started work on we've started work, but we haven't actually got a presentation for FY22 available yet. We're currently working on that now for the December 1 letter. But what I am going to be able to discuss today a little bit is the changes we're seeing so far in both FY21 and FY22, changes that are either going to affect the education fund bottom line or education property tax rates, or both. But for those of you who weren't at the last webinar and didn't see the Ed Fund outlook that was presented at that point, the bottom line is that the education fund is now projected to carry a $67 million shortfall in FY21, assuming that we have a full stabilization reserve. However, that is not going to affect either school spending next year or education tax rates, because the legislation passed last session provides that the December 1 letter that's coming out soon will not factor any of that shortfall into the recommended tax rates, and it won't follow through and be part of your education tax rates for FY22. But there are some things that are going to affect the size of that deficit that I'll go over. So. With that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about FY21 and then FY22 and try to keep them separate, although there's a lot of moving back and forth. But we're right now seeing three things in FY21 that actually are bright spots compared to what I'll be talking about for FY22. The first of those is non-property tax revenue. Now, you probably know that the education fund sources are 1/3 of those sources are covered by non-property tax revenues, and the biggest of those are the sales tax, 1/4 of the meals and rooms tax, and 1/3 of the purchase and use tax. And that's been the case since FY 2019. Right now, those three taxes are running about $24 million over the latest forecast that we have. So we're only 4 months into the year. We're $24 million up. That's a good sign, and it means that we would be likely to see a revenue upgrade when the next consensus revenue forecast comes out sometime mid-January. That does not, however, affect the December 1 tax rate recommendation that'll be coming out, since the consensus forecast won't come out until after that point. But that it's a good trend. It will have an impact for both FY21 and FY22. In FY21, the impact is only going to be on the education fund, however, because any additional money we get in FY21 will go towards reducing the $67 million deficit that's sitting on the bottom line now. Any increase that flows through to FY22, however, will be available to help offset tax rate increases next year. The second big thing going on, and I think Brad and Nathan are going to, at least Brad, are going to address this after I'm done, is pending, and that is the use of the CRF funds that were allocated to the state and made available to school districts earlier this year as part of the budget. It's possible, likely, that some of that money that was distributed may be available to reduce the education fund spending in FY21. If that's the case, again, that amount would then be available to help reduce the FY21 deficit, so it's not going to play into tax rates in FY22. But again, it's a positive that's not yet reflected on the education fund outlook or in that $67 million number. The last thing that I wanted to mention will not affect tax rates or the education fund outlook, but again, it's good news. Efficiency Vermont was allocated about $13.5 million in the budget for HVAC projects that school districts could conduct to improve air quality. They've now told us that not only can they use that entire 13.5, but they can use up to about another $4.3 million for projects, for air quality projects that could be completed by December 30th, which is a requirement of the CRF money. The JFC was meeting this morning at 10 o'clock. I was listening to it, but I'm not sure where they came down on it, but that's a request that's gone to them. I'd be surprised if they didn't approve it. So that'll be some more money that's available for schools. But again, it's outside of the ed fund system, so it won't show up in tax rate calculations or in the bottom line for the ed fund. And then, the other thing that's out there is, and maybe Brad is going to talk about some of this, but there's ESSER money and gear allocations that are out there that haven't been factored in to any of the analysis we've done so far. So that's about all that's going on in FY21. And again, nothing that's happening in FY21 is going to affect FY22 tax rates. It's going to affect the deficit that's being carried forward. Now, in FY22, obviously, at this point in time, there's a lot of uncertainty. I know that people want some guidance onto what next year is going to look like. So I can point out a couple of things that unfortunately are bad news, but I guess I want to emphasize that we're in uncertain times. It's always uncertain given the pandemic and what's happened to the economy and everything else that's going on. I'd say that this is a year that's going to be tough to get through. The first big thing that's come up is an estimate of the normal cost of teachers' pensions. Now, teachers' pensions was not part of the education fund for most of the time I've been here, but I think back in, it's not real important, but I think in FY 2018, I think we added the normal cost of teachers' pensions as an education fund use. That cost has run around about $7 or $8 million over the last couple of years. The projection for FY22 is expected to be over $38 million. So at least a $30 million increase over what we're carrying in FY21. So that's a big bump. I'm not an expert on pensions, but my understanding is that this came about for a couple of reasons. One is that the Treasurer's Office had an experience review done that covered the 5-year period between, I think, 2014 and 2019. And they recommended a number of changes in the assumptions that go into the actuarial study, both demographic changes and economic changes. So those were incorporated by the Board of Trustees of the retirement system in October, became part of the actuarial report that just came out on June 30th. So I'm not sure if that number is going to move or not, but it's a big number to keep on track of, and it's something that you guys don't have any control over. It's an education fund use, but it's not part of education spending. Second big thing that's happening is, again, this is a perennial one. Teachers' health insurance premiums are projected to go up significantly. VHI just requested approval for an average 9.8% increase in premiums from DFR for FY22. That's the average increase. If you look at the individual plans, there's quite a wide range there. And I don't have an estimate of the total cost at this point, but it's tens of millions of dollars on top of what we're spending right now for FY22. So that's also going to move tax rates next year. And it's an issue. It's something that school boards don't have a whole lot of control over once the contract's in place. So those two pieces are going to put pressure on education tax rates next year. Now, the only other things I wanted to cover in FY22 are, first, the property tax adjustment, which is a big number in the education fund outlook and always fairly difficult to project, is going to be even tougher to get a handle on this year because this will be the first time that pandemic-related incomes are going to be factored into the analysis. Most of the impact from COVID has been on lower income residents, and those are the residents that are eligible for property tax adjustments. So it's going to be difficult to nail that number down, but it's just something to keep in mind. In terms of good news, we're looking at growth in the education grand list now between 3 and 4%, depending on how much additional tax base we get in new construction. But that hasn't been directly impacted at all by the outbreak of the coronavirus. This is sort of normal because it's a look back. And of course, it isn't going to make any difference as to how much money we have to actually raise next year, but it does take a little pressure off the tax rate, which people tend to focus on in December and later. The revenue upgrade for FY22 I've always talked about. And the last thing, which this is one of the other big areas of uncertainty. We were expecting another federal stimulus bill. We're told that one's still coming. I think Mitch McConnell indicated that the first thing that the Senate is going to take up post-election is another stimulus bill. We have no idea what that's going to look like, but there's always the hope that we get some additional money and hopefully more flexible money than the CRF money that can help address the problem next year. So with that, the only other thing I wanted to touch on is, the December 1 letter. Not going to be business as usual this year. As I pointed out, the $67 million deficit or whatever it is after all the dust settles in FY21 is not going to play a factor in education tax rates next year or the amount that school districts spend. The legislature in Act 122 passed last session basically laid out a number of options for addressing the deficit that did not involve the education property tax, and they rank them in the order of preference. The obvious one they want to start with is federal funds, but it's also possible that the full stabilization reserve that we're carrying forward right now into FY22 might need to be tapped. There could be some additional revenues that could be looked at. They consider borrowing as a possibility, including borrowing from the general fund or some other funds in state government. So I guess the idea is to not have to address this deficit next year from your perspective, although eventually it's going to have to be dealt with. So I guess with that, I will stop and hand things over to Brad. Muted.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I got it. It just takes me a while to find the mute button because it's different. This is not my normal system I'm on. So I think what they would like me to talk about are kind of the federal funds that are here from the CARES Act. I've been in the middle of the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the CRF Fund. You've probably heard that from your business managers that the rules keep changing on that. They do. So there are really three pots of money that we're talking about here. There's the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which I'll come to last. That's the CRF money. There's the Ester money, which is elementary and secondary school emergency relief money. And then there's the GEAR money, which is the fairly newer money that's just finally coming out. And the GEAR is the governor's emergency education relief fund. The GEAR money is for the tech centers. It's not going to the school districts. It's for the technical centers because that's just what the decision was made to be. I just realized I don't remember the amount of money the GEAR money is, but it's all going to tech centers. It's very similar to the Ester money, which I'll talk about next. It's fairly flexible. It can be used for for staff time. It can be used if staff were not working for a while per the gubernatorial directive. It can cover that. It can cover people who are working substantially different roles than what they were working beforehand. It can cover emergency leave. It can cover quite a variety of things with that. It's also going to be used for technology upgrades, special equipment that people need in their tech centers, such as for the students and to do remote learning. It's going to cover the curriculum changes and such, and things that are necessary. Obviously, personal protective equipment too. The instructional costs, again, I think I mentioned that. So it's pretty wide ranging, covers quite a bit. That money is just being rolled out. I think those applications are just going out. It, like the Ester money, has to be granted out by April 29th of 2021. Otherwise, it's dead and goes back to the federal government. So people are aware of that. And people aren't going to waste time getting that money out there. The Ester money, that's the one that's about $31 million statewide that was given to us. That was the one that probably you heard about that had more controversies in it. The way the language is written and the way US Ed, who runs that one, interpreted it, and then the end result. It has to do with equitable service. I'll come to that in a second. But there was roughly $31 million. It was allocated out to all the supervisory unions based on their Title I allocation. So it went out in the same percentages as Title I does of the total. It's not Title I money. It doesn't have to be used like Title I money. It was simply allocated out that way. My understanding from a lot of the business managers, people telling me who are doing the Ester Grant, is that a lot of people are waiting on that one because it's fairly flexible money. It lasts longer than the CRF money. It's fairly flexible, as I said, and they're waiting to see what the CRF money is going to do and then backfill with the Ester money. Your business manager and I have been quite a bit of conversation about a lot of this stuff, as I'm sure you probably have been with them too. So the controversy about equitable services is over and done. When the language came out in the CARES Act, what it said was that it was to be allocated out to independent schools, not money out, but services. Equitable services would be funded out of that money as they were done at the same fashion as is calculated for Title I. Again, it's not Title I money, but they're using that as the basis. US Ed interpreted it differently. There was a big hullabaloo about it. US Ed finally caved and said, we're not doing that. So it went back to the standard thing where it's based on poverty counts. So it's a percentage. So that's all taken care of. If people have questions with that, and the contact person would be Jesse Roy. All of your people out in the field know that. It's in the grant management system where these grants are, so people can check with Jesse if they have questions about that. But that's now kind of off the table. It was taking up a lot of the oxygen in the room whenever people were talking about Ester, more than it probably should have. So the Ester money, again, as I said, it lasts longer. It's good up through September 30th, 2022, because the tidings amendment applies to it, and that gives it an extra year. I doubt if the people will still be spent at that point. My guess is it'll be spent mostly all this year. But the Ester money is fairly wide open, and it is designed for two things. Mark brought one of them up. It is designed for two things. It can fund unexpected things that you did not expect, so that it's not impacting your budget, that were not included in your budget, and it can also be used in place of some of the money that you had budgeted, and that's what Mark was referencing. And if it's used in place of some of the money that you had budgeted, then that money could roll forward and reduce education fund payments to you. You'd still have, the school district still have the same amount of money, but what would happen is that less money being paid out of the education fund, and that would go to the bottom line and help offset that $67 million potential deficit that Mark was talking about. Same thing holds true for the CRF money. The CRF money, Coronavirus Relief Fund, is the one that I'm pretty involved in right now. This one, the legislature allocated a total of $103 million. $13.5 million of that went to Efficiency Vermont for the HVAC system. Sounds like more is going to go to them because they think they can use it. 1.2 million of that went to independent schools. About 4 to 6, I guess about 6 million of that is going to food and food equipment, or went to summer food programs and is set aside now for food equipment and things like that. Well, I think I'm missing one other one in there. It'll pop in my head in a while. But basically what the end result is, that's leaving about $82 million in total for the K-12 systems. And that's the money that I'm working on with your business managers. What the CRF money is designed for, it's to replace and address COVID-related costs. It is fairly tight when you look at what it can be used for compared to Ester and Gear, but U.S. Treasury that's running CRF has made it a little bit more flexible than it appeared to be at first. So it can be used to pay for people who were not working per the gubernatorial directive, people whose jobs are significantly different because they're being used for different monies that have been used for different purpose. And again, as Mark said, if that's the case that you did that in FY20 or in FY21, where the CRF money can replace some of your budgeted money, that can generate a surplus for you because you'll have the right amount of money. Money will not have to come out of the ed fund to pay for those costs covered by the CRF money, and that money can roll to the bottom of the ed fund and offset that deficit. That money, that amount of money doesn't look like it's coming in where we thought it was a little bit earlier, but it's still a significant amount. I'm not quite ready to release numbers yet, so I'm getting close. Probably tomorrow that I'm going to do that. But right now it looks like that $82 million will be enough money for the ask that people are making for the coronavirus relief fund monies. We'll probably have some money left over. So I'm going to be sending that back out to your business manager saying, is this what you said? So we're all on payment. Then we'll write the grants and then you can actually draw down the money. The coronavirus relief money has to be used and not obligated, but the cost has to be incurred per federal language by the end of December 30th. So what U.S. Treasury said is they understand that sometimes that even though you're planning on having that cost, you have a contract and that says, yes, we will have this done by December 30th, and then something happens in the supply chain where it can't happen. They said that's okay, as long as it's expected to be done, legitimately expected to be done by December 30th, but it can't be done through no fault of your own, then it's an okay expense. So we're okay with that. That's going to apply to the HVAC system that Efficiency Vermont is working systems that Efficiency Vermont is working on. As Mark said, that they thought they could use another $4.3 million and get projects done by December 30th. So that's the deadline, and that's what that conversation was about. Those are the main things. I think a lot of the questions that Sue was talking about was, how's this going to impact your budgeting? Theoretically, the CRF money, the Ester money, should not be impacting your budgeting too much because it should be paying mostly for costs that you've already incurred or that were unbudgeted that you incurred. It's covering those, so your budget should not be going up because of additional costs. Having said that, the CRF money dies and is done at the end of December 30th. I'm sure that the emergency caused by COVID-19 is not going to end at midnight on December 30th. So I'm sure that things are still be continuing on. And as Mark said, there is talk about another stimulus plan. There has been for quite some time. It sounds like the Senate is getting a little more serious than they were about it. So we have to sit and wait and see what happens with that. No telling how that money's going to come out, what it's going to be for, what its uses will be, if it even goes to school districts, who knows? We will see as time progresses and things move on to this rather crazy time right now. So let's see what else. So Mark talked about tax rates. So again, just to reiterate, that deficit, that potential deficit of roughly $67 million, or whatever it's going to net out to be at the end, is not going to be affecting tax rates. The legislature did say that the December 1 letter was to not take that into account and ignore it and act as if it doesn't exist. And there'll be other things that are going to be happening with that to fill that gap. The notes that I have that I thought you might want to talk about. So I guess jumping back to budgeting, I think that for your planning purposes, hopefully most of your emergency unbudgeted things that you did not expect when you passed budgets last March, most of you, that you did not expect will be covered by the federal money from the CARES Act, either CRF, Ester, or GEARS. One of those three should cover most of that. If some of your costs were budgeted, but they're eligible costs, then what we have been trying to get people to do is to replace those with the CRF money and roll that forward as a surplus, as offsetting the deficit of the ed fund, because money would not have to come out. We will see how that all works out. Otherwise, I'm not seeing any other notes on my scrawled page here as to what I need to talk to you about. I will happily answer any and all questions I can later on, and I'm sure that I'll probably think of things that I did not cover at that point. So Nathan, I think I will turn it over to you. I'm not sure if you managed to get your camera working or not, but we shall see. Your voice is working.
It looks like I've been unmuted here, and hopefully the camera's working. So good afternoon. So we have the
off.
All right. So the question really that I was asked to address is, how does all of this impact local school budgeting? And it's a great question. And I think the kind of word of the day, as you heard both Brad and Mark mention, is the uncertainty that we're facing at this point. We're obviously facing the financial uncertainty that with respect to whether or not there'll be any other funds. And as Brad said, most of the federal money that's available to us is the kind of tap is turned off at the end of this December. And to some extent, there's money that extends somewhat longer if you have ESSER funds. But by and large, schools facing the FY22 budgeting process are doing so without the benefit of knowing that there'll be any federal dollars associated with combating the COVID-19 challenges that schools are facing. So that means, and at the same time, there's clearly not an indication that we are going to be able to stop doing what we're doing now, whether that's referring to additional cleaning and kind of safety measures, or whether that is referring to the instructional approaches of hybrid learning or being able to reach students in fully remote options. So as we start to think about the FY22 budget, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we are likely to continue to be faced with pressure to spend on those types of items, things that nobody, to my knowledge, had built into their budget previously. And yet we won't have the supplemental federal funding to do it. So that's the first and most obvious thing that I think is worth thinking about as we approach the FY22 budgeting. The second piece is a little more subtle, but as someone who's been deeply involved in Burlington's reopening plan, I can say from talking to whether it's custodians, teachers and instructional staff, principals, or other administrators, we're only, maybe not even halfway through the school year now, and I can sense a real level of exhaustion. Everyone has been asked to think differently about their job, to do more, but not only do more, like do it differently. In some cases, do it in multiple settings per day. It's created a lot of fatigue already. And so when we've started our budget conversations here, the first thing we've identified is that when you combine the uncertain financial situation that the state faces and also the uncertainty around the federal dollars, when you combine that with the fact that we are likely to need to spend money on COVID-related things, even if there is not another source of revenue for it, and when you combine that with the staff level fatigue, it does not, to me, seem like FY22 is going to be a year of big new initiatives. And my guess is that most people would already recognize that and be thinking in those terms. But I think it's important to understand that your district staff, from again kind of instructional staff to administrative staff, is probably not going to have the bandwidth to support any kind of major new investments or changes. And to that I think I would add that It's also been a challenge for schools to hire in this environment, whether it's getting substitutes or new staff into the buildings for obvious reasons. Like it's a challenging time to do the hiring process. There's people who are concerned about going to work in schools. So that's just another reason that I would say, if you're thinking about some kind of major new change, FY22 may not be the year that it's practical to put that into place. So those are really the big themes. It's financial uncertainty, it's planning for the fact that you're likely to continue to incur COVID-related costs, and to be conscious of the limitations of your staff's capacity to take on any major new programmatic investments that you may be considering. And that's all I have.
Thank you all. Let us open up to questions now. Carrie, are you here to be?
I am here, and I have two questions.
Excellent.
The first question is, when will the cost of pension funds for FY22 become public?
My hair. Sorry. Can you repeat that question? Sorry, I was fumbling here with the.
Not a problem. When will the cost of pension funds for FY22 become public?
I think it's public now. If you like, I can send you a letter that the treasurer sent to the governor last week that outlines the increase, but it is public information already.
Perfect, and I'll email that out to all the participants.
Just to be clear, technically it's a recommendation at this point, and it requires action by the legislature, but those recommendations are usually adopted because it has bad impacts on the pensions when they're not followed. So.
Okay, I have two more questions now. What is taking so long for the K-12 schools to have access to the $82 million?
Brad, you are muted.
Okay, there. I appreciate that. The fact that the parameters kept changing over a substantial period of time. The most recent one was just last week when it was decided that federal pension and retirement money should be coming out of these for the eligible salaries to go to the Vermont State Teacher Retirement System. That is what I said. I didn't specify what I was working through, but I said that's what I was just finally getting myself worked through, so that these things are done. I am looking now at a timeline of having numbers finalized today, tomorrow, and getting them back out to your business manager for a quick review, and then we'll start doing the grants next week.
Perfect. Next question. When should districts see CRF reimbursements?
Once they get a signed grant, and then they would apply. It would be just like they apply for any other federal grant, when they would send, or a state grant for that matter, they would send it back into us, and the money should start flowing fairly quickly. My guess is if we get things out tomorrow, if we get things out, grants out tomorrow, next week, I'm not sure how long it would take to sign people and get them back, but it should be fairly soon.
Great. Next question is, the email from VHI stated that over 20% of the big increase is to build a reserve. How much reserve building is built into the FY22 ed budget?
Is that the reserve on the education fund? Is that what we're talking about?
It says on the ed budget. Yes.
Mark,
the answer was yes to that question.
Okay, Mark, you're muted.
Okay, so I can take a stab at that. I'm looking at the letter, and again, I'm not an expert on teachers' health care, but the letter indicates that it breaks out the factors that were involved, including normal factors, rebuilding the reserves, and pricing alignment because of new cost-sharing arrangements. None of this would have been built into any FY22 budget. This is going to show up as education spending in FY22. when you guys develop your budgets. You're going to have to incorporate this into your education spending. So we haven't factored any of it in yet. Again, it could be as high as, you know, a couple tens of millions of dollars. So it's going to have an impact on your budget. It doesn't show up on the education fund outlook as a line. It shows up in the education payment line. So you want to take a stab at that, Brad?
No, I think I misinterpreted the question. I think what you're saying is what was asked, Mark. I agree that if this is an additional cost that was not planned on, then it's going to be in the education spending line. It will increase your budgets. It's like any other normal increase of healthcare costs or something like that.
Right.
Okay, I have two more questions now. The first one is from someone who said they can equalized pupil information for FY22 budgets be discussed? I was 15 minutes late, so please disregard if it has been covered.
It has not been discussed. That was one of my notes that's on the other page here, up at the top, that I didn't look at, that I was going to mention to you. The legislature passed a piece of legislation that said that the ADM count for this coming school year will be no lower than the one this year that you're currently using. So what that means is that if you have seen a precipitous drop in students for whatever reason, you will basically be held harmless to what you've got this year. If you have kids moving in like some towns do because people are fleeing the cities to get away from COVID to a safe Vermont, and your population, your student population is going up, you will benefit of those kids up and over whatever you had from this current year. So basically what happens is, what will that mean in terms of equalized pupils? I haven't thought that far ahead. My guess is that equalized pupils should be roughly the same or higher than what they were this year. That's not a guarantee, but that's my off the quick top of my head thinking as to how they work out, because the numbers shouldn't be changing except going up. So the equalized pupil count should probably, well, equalized pupil. Now I'm thinking it through a little bit more clearly. Equalized pupil count this year is based on last year's ADM and the prior year. If the prior year ADM is higher, which it was, and these 2 years now we're going to be using last year and this year's ADM for next year's equalized pupil, the equalized pupils count can go down because the prior year was higher. It will not go down as significantly as it would have otherwise, though. But outside that, I'd hesitate. I can't put any numbers on it.
Okay, next question. Unless anyone else would like to mention something on that. Okay, any recommendations you have on what we should be requesting from our legislators to facilitate, ooh, my screen just moved. Any recommendations you have on what we should be requesting from legislators to facilitate FY22 budgeting?
That's a hard one for me to even address because I don't do budgeting. I'm trying to think it through. I mean, you as Nathan said, and I agree, I think in FY22 you're still going to be having COVID-19 related costs. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of how that would play out. That would be part of your budget. That would increase your education spending, which would likely increase your education spending per pupil, all else being equal. And then I'm thinking in terms of the excess spending threshold. I think one thing that you could ask would be that any additional costs due to COVID-19 that are in your FY22 budget would be excluded from the excess spending threshold. That's where you get double tax if you go over a certain amount. I think that would be something that you could ask and request, and I think would be met with kind ears. Again, I don't do the budgeting, so I'm not certain. I think.
Well, let me jump in, Brad, and say
Yeah.
I agree with you. That was the very first thing I thought of too. We got to remember the timing of the legislative session is such that there are many places who have already completed their budget development work, even though they haven't voted on it at town meeting day. They've often completed their budget development work by the time the legislature really gets into it. But I do think that that is the most obvious and kind of easily justifiable thing, that I don't think anyone would argue with the idea that the excess spending threshold is not intended to penalize districts who are attempting to respond to a global pandemic. So to me, that would be a pretty easy thing to do. And I would add that as part of the coronavirus relief fund kind of rules and the way that school districts need to account for that money, we are accounting for it, put it another way. So in a sense, it should be possible to continue that accounting for that and to kind of separate that out during the budgeting process. And if that is, if that is done in advance, in particular, make it easier to report. So you could imagine reporting to Brad and saying, of our total budget of whatever it is, let's say $1 million, 50,000 is associated with coronavirus kind of response spending or whatever we want to call it, and that would allow Brad to factor that in when they're calculating, or really tax department to factor that in when calculating tax rates.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you were talking, I was trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, my guess is, I know the transportation costs have gone up significantly. It was last year and over the summer because people were doing a lot of food. So I think that might be something to think about. Again, that could play into the excess spending threshold and such. But I think there are a lot of things that as people start to run into them and start to think of them, to let us know, and we can start to keep a list and start talking with Mark, and we'll work with the legislature.
Great. Are we ready for the next question? So the next question is, so we should add healthcare at 110% of last year? To their budgets, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I'm not that well versed in healthcare for K through 12. I'm assuming that it depends on more factors than just the increase. I mean, the premium increases vary depending on the plan, and there's other things behind that I'm not fully aware of. So
right.
I hate to hazard a guess, but
I think that is a fair. I mean, at a general level, that's a fair statement, right? Premiums are increasing. That we've been told to expect a 10% increase. That may, with any luck, that may end up being a little on the high side. But the point is, that's a great starting point. Clearly, if you are in a position where really this is more of like a function that probably your business office would do, but if you know about other changes, and we've just been through an open enrollment period, that may allow you to adjust those estimates somewhat. But as a rule of thumb, I think that is the right thing to be doing.
Great. I'll move on to the next question unless someone else would like to add anything. Okay, the next question. Will the hold harmless ADM also take into account the sharp drop in free and reduced lunch applications?
That's a good question. I think it's a different count. I don't think Nathan, you might be able to jump in on this one because I'm not 100% sure on this, but I don't think that the free and reduced lunch uses the ADM count. I think there's a specific head count that they use that's different. Do you know the answer to that one, Nathan?
I don't. I'm trying to rack my brain right now, to be honest.
Yeah, it shows up in the report as enrollment. I don't know if that's a term of art or.
Well, I think enrollment's closer to what they do, because enrollment is different from ADM. Enrollment is an actual head count at the school where they're enrolled as of a certain date, regardless of where they're from, regardless of who's paying for them. ADM is by district of residence and who is publicly funding them. So I think it's two different populations. It's a good question. I will write it down and I will ask Rosie Kruger, who will know the answer off the top of her head. But my guess is it probably won't, but I've been known to be wrong before, so I'll check.
So Brad, I pulled the free and reduced lunch report from your website yesterday. Again, it indicates enrollment, so I would think it was not 8 a.m. But
yeah, I don't think it is 8 a.m. But it's a fair question, and I'll find the answer.
Great. If you could send the answer to me, then I'll send it out with the follow-up email. Okay, next question. Any notion of whether local collection of education taxes have been negatively affected by COVID? If so, how will local school districts be able to offset the need to borrow money for approved budgets?
I have not heard of any situations where the towns were unable to raise the money. That is not saying what's going to happen going forward. But at this point, I've not heard of anything. My guess is that if it had happened, there's a good chance I would hear about it. But I haven't heard anything to that point.
There was also provision in place for FY21 in the event that happened, where school boards could borrow money, be compensated for the interest cost on that. And my understanding is that nobody utilized that at all. So
it was the towns, Mark, not the school boards, but it was the towns.
Okay.
But yeah, I haven't heard from anybody that people were not able to pay their money that they were due.
Okay, I have two comments here, and I believe they're on the last question that we had. One says it is used in weighting, I believe. The second one says it comes from a direct certification list as well as a count of approved free and reduced lunches.
Yeah, the latter is the term that I was trying to come up with, and I wasn't coming up with it because it's not my world. But yeah, direct certification is an actual count of the kids in there. The weighting factor is not, they haven't changed the weighting factors yet. So for FRL, well, there is a factor in the Equalized Pupil for weighting for students I can't remember the terminology, impoverished background. We get those numbers from DCF. That's where those numbers come from. It doesn't come from the FRL counts. So I'm sure there's a correlation between the two. I don't know what that correlation is, but a freeze in the ADM, keeping it higher, should not affect either of those counts.
Okay, and I do have someone else that just said free and reduced lunch numbers do affect the equalized pupil count because they're the measure of poverty.
No, it's
perhaps
a lot of
what the previous questioner meant.
Yeah, that's not the case. It's a count. It's a count of people who receive nutritional benefits through DCF, which is different than free and reduced lunch. It's, as again, as I said, there's a high correlation between the two, but it's not the exact same population or the same count.
Okay.
It probably should be, but it's not.
Great. Our next question, our district had an FY20 surplus. Our first draft FY21 budget looks good. Would this be a good year to add educational opportunities for students?
So that's Mark, you might want to help me on this one as we go along, or maybe not.
Well, I'll help you, Brad.
That's kind of a multi-level question.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day,
it depends on what created that surplus. If that surplus was created by using federal monies from the CARES Act, CRF, Ester, whatever, from the CARES Act, what the law says is those monies should roll forward into the Ed Fund. You will get as a surplus of the Ed Fund because you got that money. If those monies were not created from that, then it is rolling forward. And then the question is it a good time to start up something new? In my opinion, and Nathan may have a different answer, and it's going to vary from place to place, but in my opinion, I would say no, because I think there's a lot of uncertainty in FY22 coming along as to what's going to happen, and this, we don't know how long this whole thing is going to go. It might make more sense to, instead of creating a new program, try to upgrade and improve some programs that you currently have, as opposed to creating something else new that you're going to have to keep going with. But
it's probably worth keeping in mind that a surplus is generally a one-time revenue source. So if you're using it to fund a new program that's going to have ongoing costs, you're going to have a problem by FY23.
Yeah, I think that's the key. I mean, I think foremost, as Brad said, ultimately your local conditions may vary and your local politics, frankly, but but I think the risk of ever using a surplus to initiate a new program is you're using one-time money and you're creating the expectation of an ongoing, presumably an ongoing cost. And I would be particularly wary of doing that when our statewide financial outlook is uncertain, because nothing's more disruptive than having your staff and students get excited about a major new investment, putting the time and energy into doing it, and then a year later saying, whoops, we can't actually afford to sustain this investment over the long term. So I would certainly I would approach it with caution. That's not to say that there's never a time to make new investments, and you may have areas where it's desperately needed in your communities, but I think it's important to approach it with kind of a healthy dose of kind of respect for the fact that the uncertainty level is so high. And as I said, depending on the complexity of that implementation, you already have district administrative staff, district instructional staff who is probably pretty maxed out right now, and asking them to kind of do more and learn more when they would normally be really excited to do that, that may be asking a bit too much of them at this phase.
Fantastic. I have one last question. If any of our attendees have any more questions, you need to get them in pretty quick, because once this one's over. The last question is, any predictions on next steps in the weighting study?
I have the feeling that it will not gain a lot of traction this coming year. I think there are going to be enough other things going on. I know there's a lot of interest in changing the weightings, in changing the weights in the equalized pupil calculations. My guess is, though, from what I've heard at the in this bizarre session that we just finished, is that it will probably put off a year. I don't know that for certain, but there is quite a bit of interest from people in there about changing the weighting study, the factors from that weighting study. I would be a little, personally, I would be surprised if it gained a lot of traction this year with all the COVID-19 stuff going on right now.
Yeah, I think Kate Webb, Representative Kate Webb, who's the chair of the House Education Committee, is planning on taking testimony on it and looking at it, I think in conjunction with the Ways and Means Committee. But I think it would agree with Brad, it's probably a heavy lift. And it's in discussions around it, it's also come up that there's sort of a threshold question that needs to be addressed that deals with the special education reform and how that's treated before you can actually decide how you want to change the weights around the other factors that were ID'd in the report. So I'm guessing that most of the focus is going to be on the special education bill and not the weighting, but they are related, and they're both going to get a hearing at least in the House this session.
And I would just say, from the kind of more local perspective, I think all those are fair characterizations of the kind of state level environment and the headwinds, so to speak, and the challenges with taking on new work. But I would say, just speaking from Burlington, I know that the Burlington School Board's particularly interested in advocating for action on that. I think there are clearly a group of people out there who feel that it's long overdue, and we've had the information. And so I think that whether or not anything gets over the finish line, who's to say, but I would expect some significant amount of advocacy on that topic.
Oh, right as I was getting ready to say we have no more questions, one popped up. How can we VSBA lead as well as in lifting the construction aid moratorium? We testified all last year, and it is needed. I'm not sure if that's for Sue Saglowski, maybe?
Sure, Carrie, I can answer that question. I'll turn my camera on. We can certainly testify to the legislature about it. We have a lot of information about the needs, and the Superintendent's Association has been very active in helping to gather information about that. So, it's definitely something that we that's on our radar for the next legislative session, among many other topics.
So if I could just jump in on that, one of the problems with expanding or resuming school construction aid is we do not currently know or have a good idea of what the status of the buildings are in the system. So there was legislation last year that almost made it to the finish line. I think it got derailed once things sort of went off the rails in the spring, but there was a bill that would have provided some money to hire an outside consulting firm and do basically an inventory of all the property, school property in the state. And I think the legislature was feeling that something like that is sort of a prerequisite to make the changes in the program. We really don't know. We know there's need out there, but we don't have a good idea where the need is greatest. And when it's an individual decision on school districts as to whether to engage in construction, the money doesn't always end up going to those projects that are most needed some intervention in. There are districts in the state, anecdotally we heard testimony that there are some health and safety violations even in some school districts that need to be addressed. So I think that they're trying to take a more holistic approach to it rather than just resuming the categorical aid program.
Okay, and one last question says, can you share the presentation that was presented to Senate Ed Committee? Does anyone know that? I don't know if they meant this presentation to them, or was there a presentation to the Senate Ed Committee that the school board members would like to see?
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not clear what that question is asking.
Construction aid, she said. We can contact them.
Yeah, I can take a look and go back and take a look and see if there was something on the Senate. Is it Senate Education Committee?
Yeah.
If there was a presentation made to them,
Yes.
there'll be something available on their webpage. I can try to identify it. I'm not familiar with it, but there may be people in my office that are.
Okay, yeah, because the next question from the person specifically is about their district. So so I can ask Sue to connect with this person and answer their questions. It says, can the VSB help our district on the PCB concerns all of us have with our schools built before 1979? Last pilot was done in 2012. And then she said, yes, in early 2020, we went and testified. So they must have testified to the Senate Ed Committee. Okay.
Carrie,
That's
I
the
can just
last
follow up
question.
quickly on the PCB question, just to say that we do expect that to be an issue that is discussed in the legislature in the coming session, that we would be involved in that conversation.
Perfect. Okay, that's the last question I have. I think we're right almost on time.
Wow.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you all.
Well,
Yes. Susan, want to close
Susan
this up?
Olson jumping back in to thank our guests. This has been very informative, and I feel like our board members are in a better position to begin or continue really with the local budgeting process. So we thank you very, very much for your time and all the hard work that you do.